think, follow the one who wants us to be in the world, but at the same time overturns our ideas of how the world ought to be organized. And I think that's where the gospel comes in. I think the gospel wants to overturn how the world is organized, but not get us off the hook of participating in the world. Bruce Epperly is a theologian I've been reading a lot lately. His 41-day adventure. He said that God has given us all that we need to be God's companions in healing the world. And so whatever it is that we need to participate as peacemakers, God has already given us. There are no special tools of the peacemaker that we have to go out and take a class. God has already given this to us. I want to meditate for a minute on power and on the cross and on Christ. And I want to meditate on Christ in light of how we remember September 11th and the death that Jesus suffered. Because I think when we understand suffering and we understand grief, and whether it be our own loved ones who have died, or whether it would be the loved ones that we don't know, the names that we read tonight, we don't know these people. These are just names, but each one of them represents a human being who is a child of God. So sometimes I think and I want to say that right now I want to focus for a minute on the cross and not on the resurrection. I think we know this tension in Christianity that we have, that some people want to be only living on Easter Sunday without remembering Good Friday. So work with me on this. Sometimes it's too painful to remember that Christ died for sin, with sin, in sin, as hatred and anger and violence and greed and intolerance and misunderstanding and frustration all found themselves hanging on the cross. What I'm trying to say is everything negative about what happened on September 11th and everything that has happened since has, in a sense, been embodied and been suffered for us. Sometimes it's too painful. And we only want to talk about how Christ lives, that Christ rose from the dead, that Christ rises again every time we celebrate a birth and a baptism and a marriage and a communion and the birthday, Troy, that you brought up, of the birthday, that somebody was born on September 11th. We want to say, from that graveyard, the flowers are growing, as Emily sang for us earlier. But sometimes, maybe it's just a little too easy or too soon or too superficial to always and only remember that Christ lives. On a dark day of mourning and death and grief, is it enough to remember that Christ had solidarity with the sinner? And that even includes the murder and the suicide. That Christ died for us and continues to die with us. That Christ suffers for us and continues to suffer with us. That Christ mourns and weeps and offers still more. Christ's tragic unity with sin on the cross and Christ's comfort in even our greatest loss cannot be confused with Christ's resurrection song. Some things Jesus can redeem, but he cannot rejoice. He can console, but he cannot condone. The horror of war, the hatred of the brother and the sister, these are not Christ's way, but Christ took those on. What would Jesus say to the power of the worldly warriors, to the kings, to the empire of violence and sin? Would Christ answer with a silence? To the power of this sometimes wretched realm, Christ responds with powerlessness on the cross. If Christ had the power that day to climb down from the cross and bomb the Roman Empire, if Christ had the power to get down from that cross and drop bombs on the Roman Empire, he refused to do so. So back in 1987, the summer of 1987, I'd been 1 year out of high school. I worked on the salad line at a health food restaurant in suburban Detroit. And it was one of these kind of shishi vegetarian places. And our dishwasher was a black man who took the bus from the city to earn minimum wage. Okay? So here we are, a bunch of vegetarians, and he was a working-class carnivore cleaning the plates and the forks that we would eat our tofu or our salads on. And he would sing gospel songs while he washed those dishes. And his favorite song to sing was, "I'm a soldier, in the army of the Lord, and I've got my fighting shoes on. So on the salad line, you had me trying to be all like zen and peaceful and not harming animals, and then over on the hotline, I had these kind of like our hotline cooks were these like biker guys, and they were like always yelling at the wait staff. And then we had Nate, his name was Nate, and he was like, I'm a soldier in the army of the Lord. I've got my fighting shoes on. And so, at the end of this decade of war, and after a century of war that preceded us, we begin another century of war as bloody and violent as the century that we just left behind. I want to ask us on this 10th anniversary of September 11th, if we want to be soldiers in the army of the Lord, and if this is the case, exactly what kind of battalion is Christ recruiting us for? What kind of war is this? And what kind of weapons does God want us to use? Does God want us to praise? Does God want us to praise even when people suffer? Does God want us to protest against violence or to protest with violence? Does God want us to be patriots, loyal to country, loyal to continent, loyal to planet? Can we be patriots to the kingdom of heaven?